Hello and welcome to GED Life at PALS. Today we will talk about how to score a college ready score in the GED Science test and get 175 to 200 points. Or let's say I will give you some tips and hints about certain skills that you should practice to get up to that score and earn your college ready plus. So let's first have a look on what College Ready Plus actually means. This is taken from the official GED.com homepage, and if you score in the 175 to 200 range, that means you have demonstrated skills that are being taught in college level courses and could be eligible to earn college credit. Depending on the program you apply to, you may be able to earn up to 3 credits in math, science, social studies, and 1 credit in humanity. By earning these extra credits, you have the ability to bypass certain required classes, which ultimately saves you time and money. So, what skills can I recommend you to practice to get up into this high scoring area? First of all, you should be an expert in all the important concepts and scientific theories in life science, physical science, and earth and space science. I've picked an example here, the theory of evolution. I've written this out earlier, and this covers all the very important points of evolution, the core of the theory and how evolution works. And you should have for yourself, for all these important concepts and theories in science that you need to know about, a really deep understanding and idea of how these theories work and concepts work, and having this deep understanding will help you a lot in the GED test to understand texts fast and quickly, and in the end answer questions faster and more accurately. So let's go over this. Evolution is driven by natural selection, which requires genetic and phenotypic variation within a population of a species and some kind of selection pressure, which is often a limited resource for which individuals of the population will compete. Natural selection will then favor the organisms with certain beneficial traits, which make them better at exploiting the limited resource, gaining an advantage, which leads to better survival and more successful reproduction. More successful reproduction over several generations means that the successful traits will become more common in the population until most organisms of that population have the trait, and this is then called adaptation. If the population is isolated from other populations of the same species for a long time, the changes of traits and adaptations can accumulate over time, which leads to speciation, the formation of a new species. So this is evolution and natural selection in the nutshell, and I would recommend you to try to formulate for yourself, for the important theories and concepts in science, such small summaries. How you understand the concept best, what helps you to understand the concept, and summarizing things always helps your mind to put everything into context and understand things better. For sure, when you make these summaries for yourself, always double check if everything is correct in them, not that you by accident remember something wrong. Okay, with that hand in hand comes a thorough understanding of key terminology in science. So online, if you look for guides, how to prepare for the GED Science test, it often tells you that you don't need to memorize terms and definitions. I agree with that, because usually all these terms and definitions are given in the GED exam in text. So if you need to know a certain term, it will be explained in the text. However, I don't fully agree because knowing key terminology is essential for understanding concepts in science. And if you go into the science exam without really understanding scientific concepts, then you're going to have a problem to score a college ready score if you want to get there. So if you want to get college ready, I definitely recommend you to practice some important definitions of key terminology of the important concepts in science. So we can pick exactly the same example. I highlighted the important words here for evolution. So each of this term should be defined by you as well. You can make some flashcards for yourself to practice these definitions, and that will further improve your understanding of the scientific theories that you have practiced already. So that goes hand in hand, understanding the theory and knowing what the key terms actually mean, knowing their definition. Now, you don't need to know the definitions by word, but just having an understanding of the terms will help you a lot. And if you forget, if you're not sure, again, in the GED exam, it's usually explained and defined, but if you have read it before, if you know it, it makes it much easier for you to understand a text in the GED, in the actual test situation. Okay, next point. Be an expert in the scientific method and its application. Especially some of the steps are very, very important here for getting a high score in the GED Science test. This is probably the most important bit to score very high in the science test. The first bit that is going to be really important about the scientific method is the hypothesis step. A hypothesis, very simply put, is an educated guess that can be tested by an experiment, and it's important that you're able to formulate a hypothesis on your own, and not only that, spot hypothesis in a text, and additionally you have to be able to evaluate whether a hypothesis is a good or a bad hypothesis, and if it's a bad hypothesis, you should be able to refine it and make it better. So that brings us to a question: what is a good hypothesis? And well, I could do a complete screencast on that topic. So let's break it down to just some very small points. Again, this is something you have to study on your own. Maybe I'll make a screencast on that later on, where we will dive more into detail here. But for now, what is a good hypothesis? We can check by asking some question. Does the hypothesis relate an independent and dependent variable? Can you identify these variables? Can you test the hypothesis? In other words, could you design an experiment that would allow you to establish or disprove a relationship between the variables? Would your experiment be safe and ethical? Is there a simpler or more precise way to state the hypothesis? If yes, so rewrite it. Especially the last point that might come up in the GED exam, refining the hypothesis, writing it in a more simple and better way. Does the hypothesis link the variables correctly? Is it only one independent variable that's in the hypothesis and not more than one? All these things. It mentions here, could you design an experiment? That brings us to the next point of the scientific method that is crucial to understand, is the experimental design process and the methodology process of a scientific project. You have to be able to evaluate the methods used to conduct an experiment and be able to spot mistakes or errors in the experiment. These mistakes or errors in the methodology of an experiment often lead to false conclusions, which you should be able to spot as well in texts and evaluations in the test. A common mistake in the experimental design process is to forget the control group. The control group gives you a baseline to which you can compare the outcomes of your experimental groups. If you don't have a control group, you have nothing to compare your experimental groups to, and you can't make reasonable conclusions. So every experiment needs a control group. Other common mistakes are missing control variables or more than one independent variable. Usually An experiment has just one independent variable which we test and observe its effect on the dependent variable. So if we make changes in the independent variable, how will this affect our results, our measurements? How will this affect the dependent variable? If we have more than one independent variables, we usually can't tell which of the two led to the change, or is it a combination of the two? So in the GED test, I guess there will be only experiments, viable experiments with one independent variable. However, out there in the scientific world, there are actually quite a few experiments that will have more than one independent variable. And these experiments can justify that with previous research that has been done and so on. But on the more simple level, it's usually one independent variable affecting one dependent variable. If it's more, we often can't make conclusions that are reasonable. So if you struggle to understand this here, there is another screencast on the scientific method. Again, research yourself as well. Again, you have to understand these terms. You have to be an expert here. What is a dependent variable? What is an independent variable? All these things you need to know to get to this high score. Okay, next step. Probably not only for the GED Science, but for every GED subject test, improve your reading comprehension, improve your reading speed. Read, and read more. Time is of the essence in the GED Science test. There will be a lot to read and time is limited. The faster you can read and comprehend the text, the more time you have to think about the questions and finding the correct answer. Practice in advance by reading science-related articles. There are many great resources online, but make sure you only use trusted sources. There are, for example, from the US government, great homepages like the homepage of NASA or NOAA that offer many great STEM-related material and articles to read and practice. To further practice, you can time your reading and challenge yourself to get faster. As well, you can read only individual paragraphs, or after reading a whole text, summarize it for yourself. Now, again, summarizing a text helps your brain to put things into order and comprehend the information that you have read better. Start by just reading small paragraphs and summarize them. Then read through your summaries of the paragraphs and you will see the whole text starts to make more sense. Once you get good at that, read a whole text and then summarize the text. Read it again and see if your summary makes sense, if you have missed an important point or not. The more often you do that, the better you will get at reading and comprehending a text, and the faster you will get at reading these texts as well. Besides reading for science, it is very important to be an expert in analyzing and interpreting graphs and charts and tables. So beside these tedious long texts, there will be graphs and charts and tables in the GED Science test. So how to approach these? Graphs and charts contain a lot of information that is condensed into a single illustration. Often you could write a whole text, a whole paragraph, pages of information, and all this information can be expressed in a single illustration in a graph. So you have to know where to look to grasp the full extent of the information that the graph conveys to you. Start by reading the title and make sure you understand it. Check if the graph has a key somewhere that tells you what different symbols and lines on the graph mean. Look at the labels of the axis and the units the variables are measured in. Make sure you understand what all these things tell you. If you have trouble understanding one of the variables or the title, check in the text that comes with it with a question. Often the variables are explained in more detail in the text. Look for these, highlight these, understand them, go back to the graph, understand what the graph tells you. Another tip is that if you have a graph that gives you a crucial piece of information, especially if it's a question that's related to an experiment, experimental design, and the scientific method. When you have a graph, the y-axis tells you the dependent variable and the x-axis tells you which is your independent variable. So this is something really helpful. It's there. It's 99% of the time y-axis will be your dependent variable, x-axis will be your independent variable. You don't have to look in the text for it, just look on the graph. It tells you your variables. If you are good at all these things already and you want to study more and become even better, what I can recommend you to do is start reading scientific papers and publications and try to analyze and understand them. This is the next step, especially if you plan to study a science-related field in college. Reading papers and scientific publications will be an essential skill for every college student, but this is usually not taught at college, so it's something that you have to learn on the side while you study at college. So the earlier you start practicing reading these scientific papers, the better, and it's a really, really steep learning curve. A scientific paper can be really intimidating at the start. There's all this specific terminology that the scientists use, the specific jargon they use. And the information is really condensed usually. So don't be afraid and try it. You can spend a lot of time on a single paper. There are many guides that online, which you can Google, that will tell you on how to approach reading a scientific paper. Again, that would take too long time to go over here. But usually it involves, especially if you're new to it, it involves reading the paper in several goes, reading it several times. And each time you read through it, you focus on different specific things and you highlight things. Again, you might only read one specific part of the scientific paper first. You can try to summarize paragraphs again and try to pick out the important information. Try to understand the experiments that the scientists have done to get to their results. Try to find which is the dependent variable of their experiment, which is the independent variable, where is their hypothesis, what do they do with their hypothesis in the end, and their conclusion, is their hypothesis confirmed, or do they have to reject the hypothesis due to the results, and so on. These are all things you can look for in a scientific paper, and by trying to understand it, you will definitely improve your skills that are essential for scoring high in the GED Science test. All right, these are all the points that I wanted to go over today. In summary, one more time, know and understand important concepts and theories in science. Build a thorough understanding of the key terminology of these scientific concepts and theories. Be an expert in the scientific method, again, specifically hypotheses, refining hypotheses, and experimental design and methodology. Improve your reading comprehension, read. Be an expert in analyzing and interpreting graphs and charts and data tables. And on top, start reading scientific papers and publications. Try to understand them. I hope I could help you and you have a better idea of what you have to do to get to your GED College Ready Plus score. If this screencast was helpful, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and ring the bell so you don't miss future screencasts. That was live at GED Pulse, and I hope to see you next time. Have a good day.